His mother's then boyfriend, a white West Presbyterian musician who had rechristened himself Shumba, felt that the school system reinforced patriarchal and materialistic values with which his common law stepchildren ought not be tainted. The principal lesson that Strike had learned during his 2 months of home-based education was that cannabis, even if administered spiritually, could render the taker both dull and paranoid. There's simply too much to unpack here and not enough hours in the day to go over all of this. Hello and welcome to Precontation Point's video Snark. If you came here because you thought that this was an audiobook, please stick around and maybe learn some reading and listening comprehension skills. I read books, discuss what went wrong, and how they can possibly be fixed. I'm continuing my read-through of The Cuckoo's Calling by Robert Galbraith. Not the first video, go check out the others, links are posted below. This book contains harsh scenes that some people might find upsetting. Viewer discretion is advised. Chapter 12. Robin knows that her job with Strike is nothing but temporary. She was, after all, assigned by the temp agency. She also knows that people who are sleeping in their offices are too poor to afford a secretary, but she's still a little disappointed when she remembers this, since working on the Lula case has been the most exciting thing she's ever done. Not long after she gets into the office, Strike's only other client shows up an hour early for her appointment. After the initial terrible meeting with John, Strike had bought cups and tea of his own, so at least Robin had something to offer Mrs. Hook. When Strike comes in, he's struggling with the 4 boxes of his belongings, so he asks Robin to distract Mrs. Hook while he brings them in and tidies his office up a little bit, make it look less lived in. While talking, Mrs. Hook mentioned to Robin that Strike's father is somebody by the name of Johnny Rockby. However, this is completely without meaning to us, since this person doesn't actually exist. Therefore, after Mrs. Hook finally goes into Strike's office, Robin goes onto Wikipedia to look him up for the readers. The article talks about how he's the lead singer of a rock band called the Deadbeats, and as she goes further down the page, it talks about his multiple wives and the many children, also the children he had outside of his marriage. Strike's mother is mentioned only as being a, and I quote, super groupie, which sure explains why it is that Shrek mentioned in the previous chapter that he'd been kind of homeless a lot during his childhood. Before Robin can continue on the Wikipedia article, Mrs. Hook screams loudly from the office, which makes her go running in to see what's going on. She started screaming because, despite the fact that she'd hired her PI to dig up dirt on her husband, she's still upset to find out that her husband is cheating on her with her own sister. Ouch. After they manage to get Mrs. Hook calmed down enough to leave on her own, Strike goes out to buy lunch for himself and Robin. When he comes back, he tells her that he's got the interview with Lula's building security guard, the one who was sick in the bathroom the night of her death. He probably won't be back by the time the workday is over, so he says that he'll sign the time card now. He goes on and thanks Robin for all of her help this past week, but kind of trails off with the implication that he can't exactly continue on and pay her for more for help. Robin is desperate to keep working for him and says that they can cut the middleman out of the temp agency out of the equation. Strike is hesitant to do that since the agencies apparently don't like it when you do that, but Robin insists that she's got some real job interviews lined up, so she'll be okay. Before Strike leaves, he asks that she'll try and get in touch with the film producer who lives in Lula's building one last time, and then says that he'll see her on Monday. Chapter 13. The chapter opens with Strike trying to count the number of schools he's attended as a child. He knows that there are probably some he's forgotten about, but he also recounts with distaste the period when he was homeschooled. His mother's then boyfriend, a white West Presbyterian musician who had rechristened himself Shumba, felt that the school system reinforced patriarchal and materialistic values with which his common law stepchildren ought not be tainted. The principal lesson that Strike had learned during his 2 months of home-based education was that cannabis, even if administered spiritually, could render the taker both dull and paranoid. There's simply too much to unpack here and not enough hours in the day to go over all of this. It's honestly no small miracle that Shrek managed to end up fairly normal, if this is the kind of nonsense that he had to put up with as a child. The narration takes a sharp left to describe the market Shrek walks through on his way to the meeting before snapping us sharply back to his time spent in that particular stepfather/mom's latest boyfriend. Then it finally bothers to tell us about his aunt and uncle who found Shrek and his younger half-sister Lucy and had taken them from there, which would probably explain why it is that Shrek ended up okay if they have the stability of Aunt Joan and Uncle Ted. Finally, a good 2 pages after the chapter starts, Shrek meets up with Wilson, but even then we need to describe what Wilson looks like, what his accent is, what Shrek ordered, and even how much it cost. And even after all of that, Shrek has to explain to Wilson why he's there, of which Wilson understands why John would be wanting more answers than simply, she killed herself. Wilson goes on to say that Lula's driver also wants to talk to Shrek. We then waste another full page talking about the military Wilson's nephew is in right now, and Shrek says that he only left because his leg got blown off, which is fine and everything, but we've already wasted so much time simply getting to the interview. Now they're making idle chit-chat, and it's so frustrating. Finally, 5 pages into the chapter, Shrek begins to ask Wilson questions about Lula. He starts off with a softball question of Wilson's relationship with Lula. He tells Shrek that she was nice and would say hello and thank him occasionally, that she signed a card for his nephew a month earlier and would constantly ask him after that. Shrek then asks about the night Lula died. Wilson says that Lula and her friend left around 7. As they were going out, Mr. Baguzzi, the film producer, was coming in. Lula and Mr. Baguzzi had words, but Wilson couldn't hear them. He then explains that the camera above the door doesn't actually record anything. It's basically only for looking out the door. But Wilson saw the two of them exchange words, and that Lula didn't look happy over what Mr. Baguzzi said. After that, Lula got into a car, but it wasn't her usual driver. He was supposed to be driving DV Mac around. Instead, Wilson names a person who drove Lola and her friend over to the club. He then says that Mr. Baguzzi collected his post and went to his apartment. Then some caterer showed up for some party that the Baguzzis were throwing, and 2 American guests for said party. Those people left around midnight. Lola came home around 1:30. Wilson didn't even need to look outside because he could hear the press calling out for her. She buzzed into getting quicker than punching in the code. Wilson explains that her usual driver can take her into the building's underground car park, but the new driver didn't have the gate code, so Lula had to walk around the front. Lula was shivering because it was snowing, and she was in a tiny party dress. She complained about the press and then seemed angry when Wilson told her about DB Mac. After that, Wilson was in the toilet being sick. In this book signature style, too much time is spent describing this. Literally, nobody wants to hear about somebody else having the runs. Nobody. He recounts that he heard a bang, which he later realized was Lula falling. When he left the toilet, Mrs. Baguzzi was there crying about Lula, said that she saw a man push her off the balcony. Mr. B was simply trying to convince his wife to go back upstairs and put something on other than lingerie. Wilson left the Baguzzis downstairs to watch the lift while he went upstairs and into Lula's flat. He was certain that he'd find Evan in there and tell Shrek that he'd often heard the couple having a loud rows, but there wasn't anybody in her flat, so he left right away without touching anything. When he caught the lift, it was already stopped at her floor. Downstairs, he heard the Baguzzis arguing in their own flat. He continued down to the ground floor where he was going to call 999, but the police were already getting there before he could start dialing. Shrek questions Wilson about Mrs. B's behavior that night. Wilson says that Mrs. B insists that somebody was up there with Lula and that she was shaking like a wet dog and hysterical about the entire thing. But Wilson also swears up and down that there was nobody in the stairwell, nobody on the lift, and nobody in Lula's flat. After that, Wilson says that he took one officer up to Lula's flat. But then the officer wanted to see the unit directly downstairs from Lula's. It was an empty unit with an alarm and no lights on. The officer smashed a vase of flowers, which is such an odd detail to include that I think that it might be important later. But the unit was completely empty and there wasn't even anything in there. Shrek then asks about how many guards working in the building, to which Wilson says him and 2 others, that he traded shifts with another guard that night who had the stomach flu, so he wasn't even supposed to be on shift that night. The only other people who work there are a couple of foreign cleaners. Wilson insists that Shrek won't get much out of them because their English isn't great. As Shrek finishes writing this in his notebook, he thinks that Wilson's answers are a little too thought out, almost rehearsed. Except that I'd like to add that it's been several months since the incident, and Shrek went out of his way to acknowledge that he knew Wilson had already gone over all of this with the police. If it sounds rehearsed and well thought through, that's because it probably is. Witnessing something like that sticks with you, and it's probably something Wilson has been mulling over and over since it happened. Shrek then asks Wilson to recount the entire day that Lula died. Wilson explains that there's a book that visitors must sign in and out of. We already know John visited his sister the morning of, but Wilson also says that there was a cleaner working there that morning and a man from the security company. He was in the unoccupied unit with the security guard when he saw Lula passing by, said that she looked like she was in a hurry. After that, since Lula had left, he let the security guy into Lula's apartment and then went back downstairs. When questioned about if the security man left or not, Wilson says that he did, but other than that, it was a pretty quiet day. He goes on to say that earlier in the week there had been a lot of people coming and going because of DB Mac's arrival, and then we circle back to the roses from earlier. They were a gift from Mr. B to DB Mac to welcome him. When Mr. B heard that the roses had gotten smashed by the police, he started flipping out over the entire thing, which again, this is quite odd behavior and is kind of standing out, but Wilson insists that it's kind of how Mr. B is. Shrek then asks about the keypad. Wilson says that it's mainly there in case nobody is manning the desk when a resident gets back, but most of the time the guards buzz them in, and any delivery man or workman get buzzed in. They don't have the code. Shrek also asks if the unit have different keys and different alarm codes, which Wilson says that they do. He goes on to say that Lula's unit alarm was disarmed when he got there. He also asks if the building's pool and gym also have an alarm, but they only have keys into those areas and the underground car park. But that door has an alarm on it, but Wilson wasn't the one who checked that. However, Wilson does admit that the pool door had been open and he wasn't sure how long that it had been open for. He wasn't sure that anybody had used it that day and says that the guy on shift before him should have checked it. Shrike then circles back to Wilson's comment about overhearing the screaming match between Lula and Evan. Wilson says that it was about 2 months before her death. Lula had kicked him out of her flat and he was trying to get back in by screaming up a storm and pounding on the door. When Wilson went up to ask him to leave, Evan left of his own accord, said that Evan was unwashed and his eyes were glassy. The chapter ends with the driver showing up. Chapter 14. So the driver, Kieran, has arrived. He says he doesn't have much time, but kind of would like to get some things off of his chest. He's not saying that it wasn't suicide, but he also is of the opinion that the police did the Lula investigation dirty. He goes on to explain that Lula had a contract with the car company, but always asked for Kieran, that the two of them got on well, but not in a romantic way, simply that they had similar backgrounds, that Lula had grown up as a black girl in a white house, and Kieran himself is kind of from all over the place. However, as Kieran starts to make random left turns into how nice Lula was, Shrek begins to wonder if the point of this isn't simply for the man to brag about how he was friends with Lula. Anyway, he goes on to say that he'd taken Lula to visit with her mother, Yvette, that morning. He says that he'd met Yvette once before and described her acting like a parasite about her daughter, calling her darling with literally every single sentence, but the visit to her mom after getting out of the hospital was going to be even more rough. To add insult to injury, Lula was also upset that Kieran wasn't going to be driving her that night in favor of taking DB Mac around, that he was a huge fan of the rapper and wanted to meet him. When Lula came out from her mom, she asked for a pen and started writing something down on a blue paper, specifically blue paper and not simply paper. Then he dropped Lula and a friend she'd made in rehab off at a trendy shop with a cafe inside. He couldn't remember the friend's name, but thought that it might have been Raquel or something like that. But about 20 minutes later, Lula came out without her friend and asked to be taken home, which struck Kieran as odd because they always took Raquel home. But the thing Lula had been writing kind of struck out to Kieran, but he says that the police wouldn't look into it. Shrek clarifies that the last time Kieran saw Lula and then asks about how he felt upon hearing the news. As you might expect, Kieran says that he was insanely shocked about it. Kieran goes on to say that he wouldn't be surprised if Evan was wrapped up in all of this, that he'd met him a few times and thought that he was a talentless loser. What's worse is that Evan was always rude to Kieran. The narration then takes a sharp right and starts going off about how Kieran is an aspiring actor. Mercifully, this lasts about half a page before Shrek asks about when and where Kieran had picked DB Mac up and where they went. Kieran says that he dropped Mac off at a club around midnight, didn't come out until 3 a.m. By the time Mac got around, Kieran had already heard on the radio about Lula. He told Mac and his friends, who started making frantic calls about the entire thing. Kieran himself didn't get home until around 5 a.m. Shrek then brings up about how somebody had tipped the press off about how Mac wasn't going to be in until later. Kieran acts clueless about that. Shrek asks about Mac's things, but Kieran explains that the record company has shipped all of Mac's things to the building ahead of his arrival. The only thing Mac had was a carry-on bag. Kieran also explains that there were 3 other cars from Mac's security team, but that Mac himself was in Kieran's car. Kieran doesn't know where the other 3 cars were while he was parked around the corner from the nightclub. Shrek asks if Kieran still has the access file for the underground garage, but Kieran says that he still drives Mr. B around from time to time. He then insists that he's going to be late, hops into his car, and leaves. Wilson says that Kieran is hoping that Mr. B will cast him in some role, but doesn't think that it'll happen. As Shrek and Wilson walk away together, Shrek asks about who else is living in the building right now. The Bigutsis still live there, obviously. A Ukrainian broker and his wife are in the other unit, and although there's some interested parties for the 3rd unit, it's still empty. Shrek asks if he can come and look at it, to which Wilson agrees, but only so long as Mr. B is out for the day. Chapter 15. The chapter opens with two massive text blocks of doom. Can we not? After I realized not only what they were, but that it was more of wanks from Strike, I mainly skipped over them. I'm not reading all of that, but I'm happy for you though. Or sorry that happened. His wanks continues on well into the second page before his younger half-sister Lucy calls. Despite the fact that she's 2 years younger than him, she's actually got her life together. The narration gives us another giant text block of doom to introduce her, but I'm quickly reaching the point of the story where I don't give a hoot about any of this. The two of them make awkward and forced small talk in which every single thing he says in response to her questions is an outright lie. She finally starts nagging him about his financial troubles, about his terrible father, and about Charlotte. When she stops, she asks if he's going to be there for his nephew's birthday, but it seems as though Shrek would rather do literally anything else. After ending the call with her, Shrek returns his attention back to Lula's case. He's kind of angry that no matter what he does, he can't secure an interview with Mr. and Mrs. Baguzzi. For lack of anything better to do, he returns back to Cuckoo, where he finds that Kieran has indeed played some walk-on roles on famous shows such as EastEnders. He pokes around various websites for a while and is kind of frustrated that Lula kept off of social media. However, there are plenty of fan-run places which say a lot of rough stuff that Strike feels was heavily edited by her brother when he first told Strike about his sister. Yeah, there's the drugs, yes, but this goes into so much more detail. Highlights include a suicide attempt as well as one person's insistence that before becoming a model, Lula was also a prostitute. A year after all of that happened, then Lula was offered her first modeling contract. After that, the narration screeches to a halt to describe, well, not so much Lula's appearance in her first couple of modeling shoots, but the vibe that she gave off of them. And here comes Horace, the dead Horace, to tell you that it's fine to stop and sift the roses in a story every once in a while, but this book is stopping more often than it's actually progressing forward, simply to tell you the most asinine details about stuff that literally doesn't matter at all, sprinkling some plot onto the padding. At this point, Strike pauses to get food, which I have to say, good job on keeping it to a single sentence. I was honestly expecting a freaking half-page long paragraph about the texture of the rice he was eating. Ugh. Anyway, after returning to the office, he then starts on an internet deep dive on Evan, Lula's boyfriend. He rose to fame playing a character in a movie who was a drug addict and got his money thanks to a mildly successful band he'd been in. Following Lula's death, there was a lot of solidification in people's minds about Evan. Those who loved him before now adored him more than ever. Those who hated him before now loathed him more than ever. He was seen leaving the same club a little after Lula left, and for some reason he was wearing a wolf mask. That's something that's so odd, but he's also a known addict, so I'm not quite sure if that's important or not. Since a lot of Lula's fans weren't exactly happy or satisfied with the police's ruling of suicide, there's a lot of online speculation. One of her fan sites lists a bunch of questions. Then Shrek moves on to the now controversial photo shoot Lula had done right before her death. It features Lula and another model, Sierra, with giant angel wings posing on a dirty alleyway. After her death, the fashion designer Samay had used it, which some people found tacky. Others insisted, and I quote, "This is an iconic show that will live forever and will continue to keep Lula alive in the memories of we who loved her." As Shrek reads that over, he has to sit back and ponder over the parasocial relationship fans have with their idols. But a lot of this is mainly because Shrek's own father is famous, and for a man in a band named The Deadbeats, Johnny apparently lived up to his name. After this, he does a deep dive on Salme and finds the approximate location of where the fashion designer lives. Then Shrek goes on to some military form, which I suppose is his wife unwinding after a long day or something. All of this is pointless filler since we already knew that Shrek was in the military. It's where he lost his leg. So I'm not quite sure what the point of all of that was. Thanks for listening to my book Snark on YouTube. New videos are up every Monday, but stick around because I sometimes drop random videos on other days too. Just as a reminder, even if you can't financially support me, there are other ways to help me out. The first is watching this video as well as all my other videos. It's also important to like and subscribe. Finally, you can share this video with all of your friends so that they can help as well. If you're already caught up with all of my videos, you can go to Tumblr for my main book, Snarks, always free and updated every morning. Newly added to Patreon is to become a member without paying. You'll get access to the same things on Tumblr, but on Patreon. Also new is a 1-week free Patreon trial, so be sure to check that out. Special thanks to Dawn, Phoebe, and Nikki for supporting me on Patreon already. If you want to hear your name in my video next week, either support me on Patreon or make a one-time donation. Do you like my snark so much that you want me to snark your writing? I do that too. For just $6 per chapter, I will tell you how awful that your writing is. But not to worry if you feel like you couldn't take the criticism. I also offer regular book editing as well, just $10 per chapter. You can contact me on any of my social media platforms if you have further questions. If you want to read some of the things that I've written, you can purchase my works on Amazon. I have a slew of spicy short stories and 2 full-length novels. I also frequently run flash sales on my stories, and if you don't follow me on any social media, you might want to do so just so you can know when I might be offering things for free. Links for everything will be posted below. See you next week, guys!